let's have a discussion on some of the issues that we have discussed so far. And we have Patrick and, of course, Terry as our panel of analysts for this evening. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. An extraordinary 10 of events where you have these two supposedly sister unions now up against one another. Teribel?
Well, it's not just two. Don't forget that there are 16 public sector unions in 8 groups. SADTU is one of the teacher unions, the biggest one, and NAPTOSA. Both of the teachers' union, although they were very angry about the treatment of the government in imposing a 3% wage rise, which was completely out of order, and I don't blame them for being angry, but they didn't go on strike last year because the government had timed it just in time for the matric exams, etc. So
just to pause, sorry to do this to you, Tori. I was talking now more specifically around the issues of the past few days, where SADTU has come out, released this statement saying it's not taking kindly to their members being intimidated by Nehawu members. So you have two sister unions, both of them belonging to the Congress of South African Trade Unions, now up against one another.
This has definitely split the union movement. It's brought the union movement into terrible disrepute, the behavior that has gone on, the fact of targeting the health sector. Look, the health workers have been very poorly treated by the employer. The government has behaved in an absolutely shoddy manner to the health workers. But that does not in any sense justify targeting A, the health sector, and B, deploying the sort of thuggish tactics that have been deployed. So all the other unions, I'm sure they may not have made statements. SADTU has made one, which is very interesting, but I'm sure that PSA, which is another one of the big unions in the public sector, would feel exactly the same way. And many of the smaller ones will feel the same way as well. So I think we must understand too that Nehawu in this instance is actually in a minority. The majority of the unions, some 54% of the membership of the public sector who are unionized, are still in the talks about wages and negotiations and negotiating about wages and conditions. That is where SADTU should be. Then, of course, if it doesn't come to fruition, if they're not happy and the rest aren't happy, they might all go on strike properly. But the point is, now is not the time to run off and, well, it is never a time to do what they've been doing, but even to strike now I think would have been wrong.
And if my reading, Patrick, of what the minister said earlier today is correct, they are consulting with their lawyers with a view to holding Nehawu and whoever else is striking responsible for the deaths of at least 4 people.
Yeah, there is a clear message. It's a red flag message out to Nehawu that they've crossed a line and that they are assessing the cost and that Nehawu will face the consequences of this. So it's an absolutely clear message going to them about what their intentions are. I agree fully with what Terry is saying, that this conduct of theirs is unconscionable. To try and blame the government for the conduct of the strike because they haven't given them the increase that they want is absolutely unconscionable. And I think that on the other point that you made about the different attitudes that the other unions have taken, notably, let's talk about SADTU, that SADTU is acting responsibly, despite the fact that they are in exactly the same position insofar as the wages are concerned. They're not happy with the wages, but they behaved in an entirely different way, and I would say in a responsible way, in a moral way. They didn't want to disrupt the exams last year. They took that into account. They took into account the public interest, and they made a decision. Even though we're not happy, we're going to keep talking. And this is radically different from the attitude that Nehawu has taken. And I'm afraid the contrast between the two approaches by them is really highlighting the moral repugnancy of Nehawu's approach to this. And I'm afraid that they are going to be visited with serious consequences when this thing plays out.
Could it be, though, Terry, that perhaps Nehawu is, how do I put it, a lot angrier than perhaps other unions, precisely because when, some years ago, they were negotiating that three-year wage deal, it was among the first to say to others, let's accept the deal that was in front of them, only for the government to renege on that agreement 3 years down the line.
Well, I don't know if it's a question of being angry or perhaps that they've lost a lot of ground and a lot of credibility. Because in 2018, the government was arguing for a 3-year wage deal, a multi-term deal. None of the unions wanted it. They all agreed in their caucuses they did not want a 3-year deal because of the way inflation moves. They wanted annual deals. Nehawu argued, and well, to the COSATU unions tended to support them, and some of the smaller ones too. The PSA, which is perhaps the largest of them all, refused to sign to that deal. But because they were in a minority, they had to accept it and go along with it, and they didn't go out on strike because of that. Because they were in a minority, they had to go along with the rule is the majority, in this case, make the decisions. Nehawu was seen as being responsible for that, and then correctly, the government and the third tranche said, no more money. That was a breach of contract. In law, it was a clear breach of contract. They got off on a technicality, which I don't think any private business could ever have got away with, but they managed to do it. They then imposed a 3% wage deal as well, which is, again, it undermines completely the concept of collective bargaining. So all the unions, but I think even if you're very, very angry and have specific reason, there is no justification for doing what they've done. And this idea of targeting the health sector, stopping food from going in, stopping children from being treated when they're desperately ill, stopping ICUs, this is not on. Yes, they can come back as they have done now since I once raised it. 15 years ago, the unions put on the table that they needed for essential service workers a minimum service agreement. Yes, I think they need one. Government has refused to do it. Instead, they've tried to increase the definition of essential services, which again annoys the union. But no matter what your annoyance, cannot do what they've been doing now.
Should it be let scot-free on this one, Patrick? Because it's a mystery to many. That the government hasn't gotten down to, negotiating this service level agreement with the unions, and it is a sign to unions that it doesn't take them seriously and will never do so until they. Embark on some of the measures we are seeing now, which, as both of, should I say, all of us agree here is less than desirable. But there are workers on the ground listening to them. Across our radio stations. We've had angry workers saying, this is the only language that the government understands.
Well, I agree with it's a mystery to me too why they haven't got this minimum services agreement. Particularly in a hospital, you can put a minimum service agreement together, sort of at a national level, based on certain activities that happen in hospitals. For example, you can identify ICUs. You can identify the trauma unit. You can identify the critical care units, the ICU units, and so on. And say in all of the hospitals, I think there are about 400 hospitals and clinics around the country. In all of them, that those people and those areas, the most essential ones, where the greatest risk of death is likely to exist, that all workers in relation to those areas are ring-fenced and isolated, insulated from any strike action at all. And, to me, it's an utterly reasonable proposition to put in place. And the purpose of the strike is to effect economic harm on their employer to submit to a union's demands. It is not to damage and destroy the employer, which seems to be the kind of thing that's going on in all over the country now. And a strike should be conducted in an orderly manner, a peaceful manner, but with minimum harm, and depending on the nature of the organization that the employer operates, particularly in a hospital, as I've described. And there's absolutely no reason that I can conceive why these agreements haven't already been put into place, either at a national scale and implemented on a hospital by hospital base, customized for each hospital, like you have the safety system, where if there's a fire, everyone knows where to go. If there's a strike, everyone knows who stays, and everyone knows who's protected. And the unions respect that, the union members are protected. They can continue their strike, leave them, not harm the public, the patients. They can avoid deaths, to take reasonable measures to avoid harm. But at the same time, they can still inflict economic damage and hardship on their employer by withdrawing their labor. And so there's no reason that I can comprehend why it hasn't been done. I don't know whether the government thinks by putting such agreements in place, it's an invitation to somehow say, okay, we're anticipating you're going to strike, and we're making measures in case you do strike. We've got a system to protect these areas, and somehow it's some sort of invitation. But I think if that's so, I don't think the logic is sound.
I mean, there's I think I was at high school when we used to do some of those quotable quotes things, and someone once said that leadership is judged as much by the things a leader does, but also by the things that they don't do. So I mean, is there no argument to be made that government should also take responsibility for not having shown leadership, for not having anticipated the situation, the ugly, it must be underscored, situation we are in now, where the old, the sick, the infirm, pregnant women, and so on have to suffer things. We're not saying this situation could have been totally avoided, but perhaps it could have been, minimized. Maybe things would not have gotten to this point if that agreement was there, or we would all be able to see Nehawu for whatever it is and whatever that means.
Well, why didn't they simply picket the government, picket union buildings, picket the president, picket something like that? Stop coffee being served, or the local drinks to the ministers, etc. You can do that sort of thing as well. And I'm not being amused, sort of trying to be funny here. The point is, I've been on picket lines before in many years in different countries when I was in exile. I've stood on a picket line with ambulance drivers, and they watched things, they let in certain things, certain ambulances went out, it worked smoothly. There was no problem. And there wouldn't be a problem if there was an agreement, as Patrick was saying, in place at the various hospitals. There's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't happen. But why target the health sector? We're talking about the public service. Now, the point is, yes,
but isn't that where Nehawu organizes?
Nehawu organizes right across the board. It's the National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union. It has membership right across the board. It's one of those strange things, because you've got the NOSA as well, which is the nurses union, but there are nurses who are members of Nehawu. So you can forget about that old rule that Cosatu had of one industry, one union. It doesn't work that way at all. It's still across the board. So they could have actually picketed anywhere else. They could also have gone back to the negotiating table and united with the other unions and perhaps built what is desperately needed, I would argue, at this stage from a trade union viewpoint. They need greater unity and they need greater clarity about where they want to go. The government, yes, does bear a lot of responsibility for the anger that exists because the health workers have been treated incredibly shoddily. Yet they're the ones who were to the forefront during the COVID, the pandemic. They were the ones who put their lives on the line. And the government said, oh, this is wonderful. And then they didn't pay them. And we now have an admission that we have something like 88,000 nurses too short. We've got doctors who are not being employed because for some reason there's no budget or whatever. At the same time, we have an extra 2 ministers to an already bloated cabinet that is the biggest in the world.
Well, Patrick, I mean, the finance minister has been arguing that it's precisely because they want to attend to the very same issues that workers are raising, that they are overstretched, they are overworked, they need more, they need, to live sane lives as well, so that they can have they can muster all the energy and the courage they need to do their job as diligently as they did during COVID. That government needs the money. In other words, it can't give them the kinds of numbers that they are asking for, precisely because the government wants to employ more police, more nurses, more doctors, more teachers, and so on.
Yeah.
Well, why don't the money if they have to? They always seem to be able to. So they could actually do so should they have the political will to do so. They simply have not shown it. And they have been grossly irresponsible as well. They've been irresponsible about the unions and the treatment of their own employees. And they've been irresponsible in not having proper policies in place, etc. That we all know. We can criticize them. At the same time, the union should get together perhaps and say, look, we've had enough. We, as one of the your Nehawu people said on your program a little bit earlier, they represent the communities as well. Workers live in the communities. We have a situation now where the majority, so many, 13 million people live on social grants. We get an increase of 5.6% in terms of child grants. But food prices alone, 13.5% have gone up. So people will get more and more hungry. There will be more and more thrown into abject poverty. This is the reality. We know that. This is a particular incident, but we need to look at that and say, look, not just concentrate on Nehawu. We have to deal with that at the moment, but say, look at why the anger exists. That doesn't justify the actions that have been taken, but also do something about it and decide, come up with greater policies. We're just useless at implementation.
None of this, of course, is taking place in a vacuum. Patrick, an interesting thing happened in Parliament this afternoon. The President was answering questions, and he admitted to having received a report, I think he said 2019, from the Public Service and Administration Department, a report he had commissioned, which of course looked at the size of the government. Remember, one of the big promises he made right at the beginning was that he wants a lean and mean, fit for purpose government and so on. And this afternoon he admitted to sitting on the report, and this in the same week that he, as Terry Bell was saying, announced a cabinet that was that had at least 2 ministers more, in spite of the promise he made years ago that he would, like to see a lean and mean government. And the reason I'm raising this is because even though the Minister of Finance has argued that the reason they can give public servants the money that they are asking for is because they want to employ more public servants. But as we are having this conversation, we have no idea as to how many police this country needs, how many teachers, how many nurses, and where and whether we are actually going to get them.
Yeah. Well, but that is interesting, I must say. You know, at the same time as there's this talk of trying to streamline the public service, make it a professional service, and right-size different departments. You need more police, you need less of that, you need more of that, and so on. I mean, Terry's right. The political will has been lacking to implement it. There's a lot of talk about it, but it has not actually been implemented. And what leadership requires to do in a situation like that is not only take the line, but do the line, to say, okay, and act on it and make it happen. And, you know, let's not forget, actually, that this happens in a macroeconomic environment, which is absolutely quite scary. You know, South Africa has got a shrinking economy, a burgeoning unemployment, potential, you know, unrest amongst many, many desperate people. And there's hardly any money left in the purse. We're on junk status in the eyes of the world, and all of these other macroeconomic issues have come into it. And behind all of these wage negotiations, these incidents happening, there's a kind of macroeconomic model for the country, which is the sort of elephant in the room. Do you have a kind of, you know, consume to grow, or do you have a grow to consume kind of macroeconomic model? And those kinds of issues haven't been resolved. And so what has effectively been happening and has been a macroeconomic belt type of necessity to live within our means, to try and constrain debt. And all of this is feeding into the kinds of activities that we are seeing. And until such time as there's kind of an openness and a transparency by government in how they're going to deal with their employees, their own employees, not just as government and alliance partners, and their employees, about how they're going to do this, I think that this suspicion and the mistrust will continue.
You know, I can't resist this, Terry. You will recall, I mean, in years gone by, there was a view, certainly among a whole group of ministers who were ex-unionists, but who were in government at the time. They remember the talk about a labor aristocracy. And I'm just, in my mind, I can see all these ministers, your ex-unionists, you know, in the form of like your labor minister, you know, your finance minister, your economic development, trade and industry, competition minister. And one wonders whether they are not taking the hard line because, in other words, the debates haven't gone back to that era where people just feel that the unions just want more and more and more, and they shouldn't get it.
I think basically, you know, the fact that individuals don't change the corporate structure changes the individuals. If they don't toe the line, they're out. So they very quickly toe the line. Tudas Nasi, you're right, he was General Secretary of SADTU. Ebram Patel of the textile workers. We had Wana of the mine workers, who used to be paid by Anglo-American, incidentally, when he was the president of the Mine Workers Union. So, you know, the unions have become very bureaucratized, and you have this seamless move from the shop floor into union positions, into government, into ministerial positions, and then very often afterwards into business again. And I think this is something that should be stopped. We don't need, I think ordinary people, perhaps I'm naive, but I actually believe that the majority of people in South Africa know what is wrong, see what is wrong, would agree with the basic political program that we have, probably the best in the world, in the Bill of Rights. And they should come together as citizens and say, right, we've had enough of this. We're not going to have a political party where we elect a president. All you have to do is corrupt the president and you've captured the country. No, let's have something. Let's go to get together and again have a proper democratic UDF, if you like, a citizens' coalition. That might be the way forward. I don't know. But that's the way we should be thinking and talking, I think, because I have quite honestly given up hope after this time that we'll ever get a real change and any real political will out of these people who sit actually in their little bubbles, very affluent bubbles, and try to placate us with loads of promises and very, very little production.
And one could argue, Patrick, that perhaps if the government had made sure, or at least made an effort to ensure that it delivers on its part of the bargain. You'll recall the president said last year in his State of the Nation address that we're going to have this social compact. That social compact assumed a situation where, all the social partners will sit around the table, talk about how to increase employment, how to rebuild the economy, of course, and within that process, or inherent in that process is, that bargaining, but which also means that, your labor unions, who are talking about now today, will commit to a specific program, to specific things, but also they will agree to forego certain things in the interests of rebuilding the economy and creating more employment.
That's right. I mean, that is the ideal, of course. That's why NEDLAC is there, to have these discussions and to do these, come to these arrangements, to listen to each other and to accommodate each other. But I'm afraid, I haven't heard much from NEDLAC, I don't know, during the last how many months or even a year. I don't see it as visible, acting as it should be, as the tripartite not alliance, but arrangement between the state, Labour, and its employees. It is the venue to do this, have this conversation, and to strike the kind of deals that could make up such a compact. But before even that happens, you need a climate, an environment which is conducive to a climate of trust. You need a reasonable degree of trust, not absolute trust. You can't hope for it in an imperfect world, in an imperfect history that we've got, but a reasonable degree of working trust to enable people to talk to each other honestly and to quietly make propositions and try and solve their problems. We need a problem-solving exercise at a macro level to make this thing happen. And I'm afraid that quality engagement could be done with facilitators, expert facilitators, to manage a conversation with them on a no-fear basis and a no-commitment basis, to get the essential fears out and try and construct something to redirect the management-labor relations, because we've slipped into this ongoing spiral of confrontational labor relations, adversarial labor relations, and far away from the ideal of constructive, collaborative kind of labor, where there's mutual respect, where there's interdependence between the two parties, and they respect each other and they can trust each other. We've slid so far down the scale of trust that to try and revive, the kind of climate that it would be necessary to make the negotiation of a compact possible is very difficult. But let's never rule it out. Ruling anything out is far too pessimistic. We have to hope that there must be some way out of it, because we have to solve it. It can't go on like this. And so, if the olive branch can be given out, something from the government, something from the unions, to say, let's try and turn over a new leaf. Let's look at things differently. Let's look at the way we bargain. Terry mentioned about the collective bargaining in the public service. I think it's dysfunctional. The government sets a budget for the year. That's how much we're going to pay the civil servants. It's X% to Y%. And then they go into the bargaining, and that's the range. It's a very narrow range, and there's not much room for movement. And so the actual process of bargaining which is a huge exercise, meetings and getting people going and so on. I think it very much has exhausted its efficiency, and that a new way of bargaining, a new way of reaching the people, the members, the nurses, the doctors on the ground, that you're going to be dealing with their needs and they're going to be listened to, has to be looked at. And so otherwise we're going to be going down into the spiral of ever-increasing violence, ever-increasing frustration and damage to property, et cetera, which we've been trying to avoid for I don't know how long.
Well, hopefully not, for the sake of all of us. Patrick, Terry, let me thank both of you for agreeing to come on this evening.